Hello and welcome back. This lecture is going to deal with the 18 schools. We're searching for, and we will be talking about how the tradition of Mahayana came into existence, how we define it. In many ways, what I'm going to be using as my definition is that we will talk about the time when Mahayana texts began to appear. And these were very important because they were the first written Buddhist texts to be used. So in order to understand how a movement such as Mahayana has come into existence is very complicated. And nobody is for sure. We are all still searching, and you in the class have a chance to join in this search. And I hope that some of you will find new ways of approaching this problem and new ways of dealing with it. As usual, I like to show you maps. When we talk about early Buddhism and its early spread, we look at the Ganges Valley, and we see that it's the spread across central India toward what's now Mumbai. And that this spread of Buddhism that we see here is the form which it took as it left the Ganges basin where the Buddha had taught, and now moves into places that the Buddha, as far as we know, never went. So it's an introduction to Buddhism as it spread. The problem that we're talking about is, as a religion like this becomes, or a movement, I should say, becomes larger, spreads to a vast geographic span, then what we have is the problem of keeping it as a single unitary tradition. We know that it started in the Ganges basin and that the Buddha traveled throughout much of what's on this map, up and down the Ganges River and its tributaries. And there were located all along in these places, which was at that time a rainforest, these little islands of city-states, if you will. And in these urban areas, which some have called the second urban development in India, the first being the very ancient Indus River urbanization, which was discovered through archaeology and dates back perhaps 5,000 years. The Ganges basin, of course, with this urbanization, was during the last millennia of before the Common Era. So what we see is that a tradition, a teacher, a group of followers developed in a specific region. We know what that region was. We know a bit about how it started to spread outside of this region. it also spread to the north. And it spread into what is now Kashmir. And this becomes a really important issue, because through this Kashmir map, as we know, past the trade routes that went toward China. And you can see that the outlines of this are now actually, some of the outline would exist inside the present nation state of China, western parts of it, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India. So we're looking at its spread, and you need to keep this in mind as we later begin to talk about where is it that the Mahayana text first appeared and first began to give us a hint of the development of that tradition. At the same time, the Buddhist tradition spread down the east coast of India. And one of the areas where you find Mahayana centers, or a center at least, is at Nagarjuna. It's on the Krishna River. The unfortunate thing is that this very important archaeological site of Nagarjuna got flooded when they built a hydroelectric dam on the Krishna River. And once the dam was in place and filled, Nagarjuna, which was such an important archaeological site, is under many feet of water. They removed some of the artifacts before the flooding, but it leaves us without the normal ability to continue to explore this position where we find the Mahayana doctrine being taught. So we have to keep that in mind. You'll also note on the map, of course, Sri Lanka. And I think that we'll be talking about it. The role of Sri Lanka in Mahayana spread, in the Mahayana textual tradition, is something which often is not discussed, because Sri Lanka today is Theravada. It is not Mahayana. And so people assume that it has no part in the narrative or the story of Mahayana, but that's not true. So we'll be looking at Sri Lanka as well. When King Ashoka came along, more than a century after the Buddha, he inherited the Mauryan Empire. And except for Andhra Pradesh and part of Tamil Nadu, we think that he had pretty much an empire of control over the vast regions of India. And one of the things which he wished to, I think, avoid was having Buddhism split into divisions. And so there was a constant movement to try to hold it together. At the same time, while spreading it geographically, which almost guaranteed that you couldn't hold it together. So I kind of smile at Ashoka, or the Ashokan time, when people were doing the very thing which guaranteed that Buddhism would begin to have differences, while decrying and being very opposed to having it split into divisions. if we approach it from the point of view of the 18 schools, then we can say that Buddhism did split into two. One was called Stavira, and the other was called the Mahasangika. Now, some people say that the Mahasangika is the origin of Mahayana, and we'll explore that. And that Theravada is a descendant of the Stavira tradition of the 18 schools. When I say that Buddhism split, one of the things which really makes the split real is that these two schools had their own ordination ceremony. You actually were ordained as a monastic into one or the other. And I think that's where we can say that we can define when Buddhism begins to split into divisions, is when people had different ordination ceremony. Because that is the ceremony which gives authority to the teachers, to the monastics, to the leaders of the tradition. And if that group feel that they belong to something that's different than the other group, then indeed the Sangha has already begun to split. So the question is, what did it split over? What did they disagree about? And part of the disagreement seems to have been about the rules for the monks and nuns, the Vinaya. The question was, what Vinaya do you follow exactly? What is the nature of the rules? Now, the Stavira group accepted what's called a longer Vinaya. That is, the rules plus the narratives that say why the rule was made. In other words, if there's a rule that a monk should not sleep on a bed that's higher than 20 inches off the ground, why is that? And there's a story to say, well, because during the time of the development of the tradition, there were monks who began to have high beds, and other monks who said, no, you should sleep directly on a mat only, no bed at all. So these schools began to split over whether or not so much the rule, interestingly enough, but the question of, did the Buddha himself tell the story about why the rule was made? Or was the story about why it was made something which was later developed by the disciples or the monastics? So the Staviras said, we like the longer Vinaya. And of course, the stories are very important. And for them, they accepted. The Mahasangikas, we are told, said no. The Buddha didn't tell those stories because he was living it. Why would he tell the story? He made the rule. He didn't need a story to make the rule. He knew what was going on, and he began to give the rules. So it was over monastic life that these monastics began to argue among themselves as to, do we just hold to exactly what appears to be the oldest, or can we accept an expanded version which explains and which has value? So ordination was a big issue. And these two schools were struggling with it. So the 18 schools that came into existence in the 3rd century of before the Common Era, they had separate ordination. And the ordination was based on which of the Vinaya positions they would accept. And this is still the case. If a monk is ordained in today's world, whether it's as a Theravada monk in Sri Lanka or Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, or as a Mahayana monk in China, Japan, they subscribe to some set of rules. Now, later on, we're going to discuss the fact that this Vinaya issue became even stronger when Buddhism spread farther away from India and spread all the way to East Asia. Because as you note with the picture here, these monks are wearing a robe, which is not sewn, but which is wrapped around them. And their shoulders are bare. And they were barefoot often. But when it got to China and you got sub-freezing temperatures, it's impossible to hold on to this form of clothing and survive a winter in North China. So it was, as Buddhism spread from climate to climate, from area to area, that once again, it was the Vinaya which began to break down first. The rules of conduct from one place to another, of necessity, at least in the eyes of the people, had to change. And so the whole ordination principle is in the background as we talk about how Buddhism splits. So the Vinaya, the Mahasanghikas, they were opposed to expanding the Vinaya. Whereas the Stavira Nikaya, as it's sometimes called, Nikaya meaning a group, wanted to include the expansion. So as far as dealing with the 18 schools, this was the first described break in the unified Sangha, the unified community of Buddhism. Now, the 18 schools are very difficult to study. They are difficult to study in part because, number one, the exact list of the 18 changes from one text to another. Sometimes there are 21 schools listed. The order in which they're listed changes. So people have tried to go back and discover what actually did these 18 schools believe in, and what was their function. The big question is, did the 18 schools mean that this was the whole of the Buddhist tradition? That these 18 covered every single Buddhist group for a time? And how long did that last before it began to fragment further? So we look like the Sautranticas. Well, the Sautranticas said, we just want the word of the Buddha. The words which Ananda remembered him saying. We don't want to include any of the other texts which are written later or which are different redactions, just the sutras. Others accepted such things as the Abhidharma, the Darshtantikas. They said, for their tradition, we need examples. That is, the texts they were explanatory, and that the examples belong in the canon, belong in the teaching, and that you have to accept the examples that are given for the teaching, as well as the teaching itself. Well, there were other groups like the Vatsiputriyas, where they are dealing with what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, association. And let's hold that discussion till I get into it. But you can look, the Samatiyas, they were a subgroup of the Vatsiputriyas. And the Purvashailas, these were the Eastern school tradition. And so it goes. So how do you study all of these? How do you make good sense out of them? Well, think of it in this way. These are another way of saying that the Buddhist tradition had a constant debate. There were people debating and making their case all the time. And some of the debaters held to positions that survived the debate. And others lost out in the debate and disappear. So when we say that the Buddhists had debates, I think that's what this means when we look at the 18 schools. So if you want to go and look at each of these schools, you too can study what they felt was the important issue. And in many cases, they agreed basically with one another, but they had one or two important issues in which they differed. Let's look, for example, again at the Vatsiputriyas. I said association. Here's what that means. The question is, we have experience as humans. So the question is, what is that experience? And who is the one who experiences it? So the Buddhists were really struggling because they were trying to hold to a central doctrine that there is no permanent existing self. There is no permanent existing thing. Everything changes. Everything is in flux. So how does that work? Well, the Vatsaputriyas agreed with another group that there is an agent or an agency, I should say, that experiences. And that experience comes in the form of mental events. So how do mental events and the agent interact with each other? So this group said by association. They said it's like fuel and a fire. What do you have? You have fire, one thing, right? Fuel, another thing, right? Well, not quite. Fire can only exist with fuel. And fuel, when it is fire, that is an association. In other words, you can't have fire without the fuel, and you can't have fuel without a fire. Same thing with a wall mural. And remember that they used fresco. That is, the frescoes meant that they had wet walls that they painted on, so that when they paint, the paint would soak into the actual clay of the wall. So then they said, what's the difference between the picture and the wall? Because the picture is the wall. It's part and parcel of the actual clay that makes up the wall. So that's what association means. That things can be two different things, and yet they are associated with each other in such a way that you can't separate them. So with us humans, we have mental experiences. We see form, we smell, we taste, we touch. We have ideas. And with all of these, we are having, these are the aspects of human experience. And that is all we have in the sense of our bodily experience. So that tells us then that when the Buddha said there's no self, then what is there that experiences these mental events? The Vatsaputriyas were arguing. They said, just like fuel, if you have fire, that is experience, the experience, the fire, and the fuel are in one way, one and the same. You can't take one away and have the other exist. Same with the wall and its painting. If the painting is the wall and you take away the painting, there is no wall. But without the wall, how can the painting have a place to be? It's a rather complicated issue and a rather complicated argument. But this is the kind of debate that was going on in Buddhism. These were these 18 schools and how they debated with each other and struggled to determine what is the nature of experience, what is the nature of a human life, what is the nature of myself, what is the future, what is the past. So as Buddhism spread and it began to fragment into these debate societies, these 18 schools, and they were fully debating with one another, it would be a time of, it seems to me, for a lot of lay people, very difficult for them to quite comprehend what the issues were. So for many of them, a monk was a monk. The robe was enough. Show me a robe and I'll make a donation. But within the tradition itself, and we'll see this as Mahayana begins to emerge in this debate, within this debate for the monastics, it was serious business. They didn't kill one another over it, as some traditions, religious traditions, say you either believe and agree with me or you're going to be killed. They didn't do that, but they certainly argued. Well, in the region that we have been looking at on the map came a King Kanishka. And King Kanishka had made coins following the Persians, and he put his picture on the coin. And on the back of the coin, he put a Buddha image with the word, which means Buddha. Now, with this area in which King Kanishka lived is what's now Kashmir, that we discussed, and we'll discuss this a bit later, so that we ask the question, what was the role of empires? What was the role of kings? How did the Sangha, how did the Buddhist community survive when its leadership were debating very obscure and difficult positions? How did it deal with all of these issues? And that's part of what we will continue to explore. Again, not easy answers. Well, in the Northwest, up in the Kanishka ruled area, a group called Sarvastivadins emerged. And the question was, what was their big argument? Their argument was that the three times exist: past, present, and future. There were other Buddhist groups that said these are just arbitrary divisions. There's no such thing as past, present, and future. There is just the constant flow. The Sarvastivadins said no. if you have an experience, it's not so much that you have a thing, but you do have an event. And an event has a beginning, has a moment of existence, and then it ends. And therefore, said the Sarvastivadins, in order to understand the event of a mental moment as an event, you have to accept these three times. You have to accept that an event has this pattern of flow. Now, they also fought over other issues. The Abhidharma, the collection of all the words and all the teachings of the Buddhists. There were people fighting over, was that original? The Buddha didn't teach such a thing that anybody could remember. So others came and said, the Abhidharma that was taught by a Buddha in Tushita heaven. And it was that teaching which created the whole unit of the Buddhist scriptural tradition. But again, debate. Again, arguing over what is authentic, what do we accept? And it was not that they were saying that if you don't accept this, you're not a Buddhist. The debate was not whether or not you're a Buddhist. The debate was whether or not you had the right idea as a Buddhist. And if not, then the debate was an attempt to make sure that you did get converted to the right idea. So we come to Mahayana, which is the focus of this course. And the more recent idea has come that Mahayana arose somewhere in Gandhara, up there, basically inside the square, part of the Indus River Valley, and that in Gandhara, where there are still, of course, some magnificent archaeological remains, that it's from here that the Mahayana developed and spread, the Mahayana text. So some people's, and particularly Professor Brunkhorst in Switzerland, is making a strong point that he believes that you had the emergence of Mahayana from this region. If you read his work very closely, it seems as if he's really saying that from this region came the idea that dharmas, mental events, are empty. They are mental events, they are events, but they have no lasting reality. They just occur. They're like phenomena. They're like a flash of lightning. They're like a bubble. And that idea, he feels, originated in this particular area of Gandhara, and that says in a sense that Mahayana had a single home, a single place where it emerged. But of course, the problem that we have is that's not the whole of Mahayana teaching by any means. It is true that they do have this idea that the mental events are empty, but they also have texts that are filled with a multitude of ideas. And so you can define Mahayana as only teaching that mental events are empty, but it is not a definition that will fit the Mahayana that we find scattered throughout the world. I think that perhaps Professor Broncos is correct in assuming that this particular idea originated here, this particular argument, and probably that he would never go beyond that anyway. It came from this place, and that's crucial for us to remember and to keep in mind. This was a great Mahayana center, that these were people dealing with what later came to be known in the text as major ideas. So we have the earliest Mahayana text, the 8,000 line. And the question is, when do we have this text? The Buddha's time, no writing existed. It was not possible to have something like what you see on your screen during the time of the Buddha. This came later. So that when the Mahayana texts appear, and there's a great difference in my view between when the texts appear and when so-called Mahayana appears, because it's very hard to define Mahayana as opposed to Mahayana text. I primarily have spent most of my career working with Mahayana texts, Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan. So when we're dealing in this course, we're faced with some very difficult issues, fascinating ones though. And the question is, how can we see Buddhist history? And in what way can we deal with it? And when people say, well, Mahayana is a later tradition, what's meant by that? And when you talk about up there in Gandhara, that there was a strong group that taught that the mental events are empty. Well, how different is that from what was taught all the way back to the beginning in the Ganges Basin? That was basically that everything changes, nothing stays. But if we're talking about the text, now we have found some birch bark. They've been using carbon dating, and they're saying that these physical texts, fragments that we have, could be dated back to the 1st century of the Common Era, or even the last decades of the period before the Common Era. So we're dealing with very early textual traditions. We're dealing with a very sophisticated debate pattern. And it's been made as simple as possible for people in terms of the description by saying there's Mahayana and there's Hinayana, and you just put the 18 schools and everything else under the term Hinayana. But I think that these arguments miss the point. And the point is, in order to understand the history of Buddhism, I think we have to understand the debate. And what was the debate? The debate that has come down to us in textual formations were sophisticated arguments about the nature of reality, the nature of a person, the nature of a mental event. And these are not easy issues. But it is out of this that the Buddhist tradition was constantly in ferment and was being changed and made available to each generation. And while all of this is going on, how does Buddhism survive? How do you convince people to give you support when you're arguing about some very minor point of a mental event? Buddhism is seen as powerful for luck, powerful for rebirth, powerful for protection, powerful for giving individual an ability to be free of suffering. That's the other side of the Buddhist tradition as well. And we're going to look at that in terms of how that became expressed in the Mahayana. So this is our exploration for this semester. It's both complicated and simple in a way. That is, a debate could be raging in a monastic environment, while in the public environment, for most of the followers, the tradition offered solace, support, and in this way, it was able to sustain the support for a very extensive debate, but also for a tradition which helped people as they live their lives from day to day. So I look forward to having our Q&A on this and to continue this exploration. Thank you very much.